Good morning.
Hello.
Hey, Amir. Where are you located?
It's evening here. I'm in Israel,
In Iceland.
Tel Aviv. No, Israel.
Oh, Israel. Got it. Sorry.
Yeah. What about you?
Just outside Boston.
Boston.
Yeah. Who do you work for?
We're called Spector. We're a small startup that it's doing distributed tracing
Oh, cool.
over open telemetry. Yeah.
What aspect are you like a back end for it? What's your stuff?
Yeah, we're a vendor. We give managed tracing solution. We also have some special features. We try to extract data from pre-production and use it to verify the PRs.
Interesting. So you sort of you overlay what's happening in pre-prod with prod, and if it deviates, then you sort of, wow, that's cool, man. I like that.
Yeah, cool. Hello, everyone.
Hi all, good morning.
Hello.
Nice to see you all. Let's give it a few more minutes. I added a link to the meeting notes in the chat, so please add your name there and add any topic if you have anything specific. So yeah, let's give it maybe one more minute and start at 8:04. It's kind of half a minute. Okay, I think we can get started. I will share my screen so we can see the agenda. So the first point I put here on the agenda is next week, Thursday, there will be Thanksgiving. So most of the people working in America will have a day off there. So I was quickly checking in with Ted before and asked how this is handled with these open telemetry meetings on those holidays, and he said in most instances they're just canceled on American holidays. but just wanted to check here if you are fine with canceling next week, or if you are eager to meet.
I'm personally good with canceling.
Yeah.
Yeah, fine for me as well.
Sounds good. Then we will skip next week, and I will just then put a note here in the meeting notes, so that also the people who are not here in the meeting kind of know that will not be there. Okay, the next point is I also put it on there, and I started thinking about in our roadmap, basically, that we worked out, we had this kind of first OTAP where we worked out the scenarios and also what's out of scope. And then as a next point on the roadmap, there's basically an OTAP then kind of with the more or less list of changes that we want to make to the spec, or basically with an OTAP that kind of drafts a new version of the spec. We need that before we actually change the spec. And I started thinking about what should be in that OTAP. We already had quite some discussions that fit in there very well. I think there are some discussions from the cloud events, discussions that we can take over there. And I started summarizing here what should be in the OTAP. And I think we have 3 big areas. The first one, that's basically what we talked about up to now, it's context propagation. Then a second area that's still unclear to me, and we didn't talk about it all, is batching. And the third area is what actually makes the bulk of the current semantic conventions is its span names and attributes. So I think those are the 3 areas where we need to that we need to cover in this OTAP, and that we need to cover in the semantic conventions. And I intend that in maybe December I start to kind of maybe write the first draft of that OTAP. And here I just started to collect some notes from our previous discussions. And I thought maybe today we could go through those notes I made for context propagation, which are based on previous discussions that we had and also that I had with some people individually. So just that we're on the same page there, and maybe we can even start shortly talking about batching. And so I think, Joao, you put the cloud events PR on the agenda again. Maybe we can time box that to the last 10 minutes of the meeting. Sounds okay to everybody?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, so for context propagation, I think we did not explicitly point it out, but I was talking to some people, and I think this different layers of context, I think that came up again and again, and I just wanted to double check here if that makes sense for everybody. I put it here as kind of an introductory sentence for this context propagation, because I think what we see, what we also saw with cloud events, and what we see in messaging is that we have 2 different layers of contexts. And I here just called it application context, and I called it the other layer transport context. And I tried to map this to our model of stages. And the application layer, as I understand it, basically comprises this create and process stages. And interestingly, in all the examples, also in the existing semantic conventions, we always have create and process spans for messages. So that is kind of, this layer is always covered. And then for the transport layer, if I would try to map it on the stages that we have, it includes the publish stages, the receive stages, and it also would include any kind of intermediary instrumentation. I think that would count in this transport layer. And I think why it makes sense to keep those two layers apart is I was also thinking and talking with people about use cases for messaging instrumentation. And oh, sorry, I lost this here. I clicked somewhere wrong. And I think one use case is just a very high level use case where, let's say, people maybe just have their application map where they see how their services are connected together. Maybe they have, let's say, 30 microservices working together, and they just want to see, okay, this message was processed here. Where was this message created? And that is enough for them to know. They just want to make these links. And I think that's a pretty popular scenario. And it's just this view from this high level. So those people are not like interested about transport details or what protocol is even they're used. They just want to see, okay, that's how my services connect together. And this was sent here and was processed here. And that's all I want to know. So basically, that's, I think, what is covered by this application context. So here, basically, you create a message and you process it and you want to link this together. And then I think there is the transport context layer, and I think that gets interesting when something goes wrong. So for example, when your message does not arrive where it should, and you want to look into that. And I think then you need all this lower level information from this transport layer, like where was the message published and what happened in between, why did it not get to the receive state. And I think having these two layers separate in our mental model, I think can help us also when kind of further refining the scope of the conventions, and also when maybe refining what actually what we need to cover with this version and with this first version and what we maybe don't want to cover. Because I think this application context, that is, from my point of view, that's a must. We also see that in all the examples that we saw, there's always this create and process and some kind of link between. And for this transport context layer, I am not sure yet how far this will be part of these messaging semantic conventions, or how far actually that might be covered by different semantic conventions. Maybe not wholly, but partly. For example, you always have, like, if already have this case when the transport context layer uses HTTP, that's already a different set of semantic conventions. And when the transport goes over AMQP or MQTT, I was actually pondering whether those would also be covered by a different protocol-specific set of semantic conventions and not by those messaging semantic conventions that we're working here on. So I just wanted to throw this out there and maybe get some criticism or input on that.
Just a question of clarification. So the application, the application context and the transport context, are those linked together via parent-child relationship, or is it linked using a link relationship?
I think that is. I think we didn't settle on any decision there yet how they are linked. Okay. I think in those points that I put down there is just that. I just put it here very generally, and I just put in there that create and process spans for single message need to be correlated. So there must be some correlation there. Whether that is a link or parent-child relationship, I didn't put it in there. I mean, based on our cloud events discussions, it seems we are tending more towards using a link for that. But yeah, we didn't yet come to any kind of definite agreement or consensus on that. So that I left deliberately open. The only thing I think that we're clear is that they need to be somehow correlated, because that's what I think that is what unifies all the examples that we currently have with create and process, and they're somehow linked.
No doubt. I like the conceptual framework, so that definitely helps me think about things, and what I think is the right way to think about things. And like I said, the details can be TBD.
The part I have a question about is how much of the transport layer should or shouldn't be in the messaging semantic conventions. I think, you know, it would be nice to see the concepts covered in the messaging semantic conventions where the details go off somewhere else in terms of, you know, how the context goes into a message, whether it's HTTP header fields or, I don't know, AMQP message annotations or whatever. But it would be good to see the concepts defined in the messaging semantic conventions. I don't know what you think about that.
Definitely, yes. I think what we need somehow to define is for this, when we talk about these two layers of context, we also have basically two, in OpenTelemetry terminology, two context objects, or two kinds of context information that we need to manage. Like this, for this application context, for being able to link, create, and process, we somehow need to communicate this context from the create span to the process span. So that needs to be conveyed somehow. And I think that is definitely something that we need to define, or at least give kind of options of how this can happen. How can you convey this context? And that might involve protocol-specific mechanisms. For example, cloud events is one way to specify that, or AMQP has other ways of kind of attaching context to it. So I think we need to clarify how we relate to that, or how we use those mechanisms. But I think what we should not do is kind of give detailed guidance or detailed kind of conventions of instrumenting and creating AMQP spans or MQTT spans. I think that is on the transport level layer, and I actually think that should be covered by a different set of semantic conventions that then can be used together with messaging. That kind of you can have both, but I think should be defined separately. Otherwise, I'm just afraid that the scope of those messaging semantic conventions will get really big when we put all those possible transport layer protocols in there too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like I said, I think the concepts are kind of common between transports, but the how is different. And you know, I would sort of see the implementation of a propagator interface would define the how of, you know, how a context is carried in these different transports. But in terms of what should be traced, you know, and maybe there's differing views on this, but I would think would be somewhat common between different transports, and I think it would be nice to see that described in the messaging semantic conventions.
That is a fair point, and I think when I also don't want yet kind of nail down and say, okay, we don't do this transport context layer at all, because I think when we talk about batching, I think when we talk about batching and we talk about what kinds of batching scenarios do we want to support, or what kind of observability scenarios around batching do we want to support, I think that will also give us, or this will heavily influence our decision about what parts of the context layer we will actually cover. Because I think batching in those two, when I look at those two layers, happens mostly on the transport context layer, except this batch processing, which is a different part that actually happens on this application context layer. But I think most of the other batching scenarios that are also covered in the examples happen on this transport context layer. And I think when we talk about batching, we will also see what scenarios we want covered there, and how much of this transport context layer we actually need to instrument.
The batching for the transport layer, you mean because I can send a batch of things and we have to find out how to properly create a span that somehow connects all the things together? Or?
Yes. I think batching is still a very unclear concept for us, what all kind of falls in there. and it comes up again and again in very different usage contexts, and I think that should be the next thing we discuss about in detail.
Yeah, because I saw also some other issue somewhere talking about batching in databases. I think there was something this week that I saw somewhere. It was the same. So, but for us in this case, it would be a problem. For example, like Ludmila said at in one meeting about the attributes. So, like because we have a batch being transported, which attributes do we put into this? Yeah, expanded in the transport layer, right? But this would also be the same for the application. Let's say application layer, right? Instrumentation. If we have dealing with batches, right? I guess the problem is the same mostly.
Yes, I think for us the first thing to answer is what batching scenarios do we want to cover it all, or what kind of observability insight do we want to give the user into those different kinds of batching that might happen. And I think that might there will be then some I think we might then discuss about including certain scenarios and not including other scenarios. And it's still, I don't have yet many ideas about that, so I actually look forward to discuss that. And the only thing here with this short paragraph here, I just hope that we can agree on what's in there, that's okay for you. I think we agree that it might be not enough yet what is covered there, but I hope we at least can here actually I will make this less strong. I said context propagation rules for the transport layer may be defined by different conventions, so that is something that
because
we might be not sure about, that we are not sure about yet.
Yeah, so because this quite follows, because as we've been working on the cloud events thing, it is its own semantic conventions, and there we tell how the context is propagated. So I think it kind of just feels natural to also create one for each of these different things, right? AMQP and so on.
So basically, I have, based on this distinction above here, I have 4 main points here, and basically the first one is that we say, okay, those context propagation rules for the application layer, like for this create and process stages, that's something that we need to define in the messaging semantic conventions. So that is strictly part of this document that we're working on. And as I said, that's also something that I saw in all the examples we have there. So we always have create and process, and I think that is just the minimum. That is the minimum that is needed. And here that's more or less creating the obvious, saying that for creation and processing stages, we need spans. Otherwise we cannot trace anything, so we need spans. And for each message, there is a create span, and there can be 0 or more process spans, just depending on the messaging scenarios that we have.
Can I comment on this one?
Yes.
I think if there's a processing span that's the father of all the operations that are being done downstream for processing of one message, it's great. We should try to have it where possible. But I think that in lots of real world situations, it's impossible to create this processing span. For example, in SQS, there is no way, like the code is written in a way that it's not scoped in any way that you can create a processing span. And also in Kafka, if you receive a batch, then you just simply can't tell when you process each of the individual messages. So at least in my experience, it's not always possible to have the processing span. And I believe we should be ready, or at least describe in the spec what should be done when the processing span is not because
Yes.
otherwise people will just write instrumentations. They will not be able to create it, and then they will just do some workarounds which are not consistent and not formalized in any way, and make backend processing much harder to take actions. And I'm not sure if it's like if it fits into this agenda here. I also have other small comments about things that I believe should go into the specification. For example, today the link that we're putting on the processing span, it's just like a link without any annotation. That's like, it's possible that there are other links which are not carrying the sender context, the sender application context. So if you're writing some backend processing and you receive this processing span and you have 5 links, there's no consistent way of telling which one is the one that should be used. And in addition to that, I think we can also enrich it with some other data. For example, if the sender is sampled or not, because it can make life very easy for, like, for example, if you know that the sender is not sampled, then you know that you can, I don't know, visualize it in some way, or not spend time executing a query, which will for sure not return anything. And we have this data, it's just not in the spec, so people don't place it in their instrumentations. Yeah, so, and I have a few other issues. I'm not sure if it's the time to bring them up. What do you think?
I think maybe the best thing would be if you just add those as comments here to this document, if that works for you. Because I think here, I think what I tried to put together is just the minimum. And if you could just add here what's missing, in your opinion, and then we can discuss like the comments that you have on the side, maybe partly like offline, and what's open we discuss in the next meeting, if that makes sense for you. Because for this one here, that is a very good one, and I think here, basically I said each message can have 0 or more process spans, and basically when a message does not have like a process span in any way into traces, that either means that the message was not processed at all. That's one option, or it's what you mentioned here, that the message was processed, but for some reason you cannot create a process span. I'm not yet completely sure about reasons why that is the case, that you cannot create a process span. But if there are those scenarios, we should somehow give guidance there in the semantic conventions of how to handle those. Because I think that's an important distinction to make, or for the user to make, to see, okay, was this message processed or was it not processed?
I can give an example. For example, in SQS, if you're familiar with it. So the AWS SDK, you're doing a receive message and you get back like an array of messages, and that's what's returned to the user, to the return from the library. And then there's no way to tell how the user will iterate over it. Like, it just is a plain array of messages, and the user can do whatever he wants with them. He can for loop over it, he can map or for each it, he can just take a few messages and handle it in any way that he wants. There's no like callback that says process a message and then you can wrap it in a context. And
but isn't it, so I think Ludmila actually brought a very similar example with the Azure SDK at some point, that there was also like receiving a list of things and no idea what the user would do. And I think it's pretty much also the same thing that happened last week in the Cloud Events discussion, because the Cloud Events SDK also don't have a consistent way of dealing with things. So I wonder what we should do, because I mean, if you receive something, maybe the SDK could be changed in a way that you can have some way of hooking into it or exposing something into it, and if we shouldn't drive this to be done as well.
So my thoughts on it was that sometimes it's just impossible to automatically detect or scope the single message processing, but vendors or SDKs can supply like decorations or enrichment ways, so you can, if it's not linked, you can like tell it in the code, like what I'm doing now is part of processing this message. And then, yeah, and then it might be useful to add links to the producer, not only for processing spans, which are not guaranteed to be available, but also to like any span. Like tell this span is part of processing this message. And I was not able to supply a processing span to group everything together. And sometimes you can have multiple processing spans. Like if you have like event emitter that's you can register and say on message do 1, 2, 3, and you can write many callbacks. Then it's much easier to have multiple processing spans, one for each processing within the application. So like in real world, the situation are much more complex than our easy example, which we always follows. And I believe we should discuss it.
Definitely. I think the main problem you're hinting here at, Amir, and I think, yeah, as Rao said, we saw this with cloud events, and I think we will see that with messaging scenarios in general, is that I think for the transport context layer, we can safely say that like for SDKs, let's say now the AWS SDK or the Azure SDK or other SDKs for messaging system can create those spans for the transport context. I think that is usually 100% in control of those SDKs, so they can do that. For the application context layer, it's more complicated. So the SDKs may not be in the right position to create all those spans needed for the application context, as you hinted at with processing. You said, okay, you pass those messages out of the SDK, and then it's up to the user what to do. So for our model, actually, then the user would need to create this process span for the single message and then link it to the create span. And I think that is one challenge that we'll have here, that we already partly have for cloud events to kind of give proper guidance for that scenarios. So it's like we saw in some instances, the SDK might be able to create this span. In other instances, or in other usage scenarios, the SDK might not be able to create these spans, and then what kind of what should happen in those instances? I think, do we say, okay, the user needs to have some kind of callback to inject this context information or create this span, or do we have different ways of dealing with that? I think that is definitely a question that we need to answer when we then work out the details of how those points should be kind of specified and implemented. Does this cover what you said, Amir? Is that...
It's covered these issues. I have some other issues similar to it. For example, if the processing span is missing, then there's no way, there's nowhere in the trace that you can link to the producer span. It's just you break the connection. So I was thinking something about maybe like having an array of all the links on the receive span. So if the processing spans are not generated for some reason, you can still link them together. I know that it will be very useful for me, and I believe that it will be very useful for other people which are trying to make sense out of these traces in real world situations. So this is another issue.
I think to summarize what you proposed here is that when we say, okay, we don't have this link between create and process, we are not able to have this on the context layer, then maybe we can create this link on the transport layer. that you say, okay, we have this receive span, we know this is somehow linked to this other publish span that links to the create span, and basically we link it together on this lower level layer.
Yeah, we should have it somewhere that will guarantee that will always be available and consistent, in my opinion. Because it happens, like that you don't have the processing span, and then there's nothing you can do to connect those.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's basically just another variation on this same point, that when you say, okay, it's not possible to create a process span, what do we do then?
Actually, that could be a good idea, because we could also always add the links on the receive. So like if the library that does so like, for example, if I'm using a library and then the library is able to, and we know that it is able to capture the receive and send, then it can just look at the things and add links, like always add it. So if you have the processing, you have more information, but if you don't have the process, then at least you have that. I think it's a good idea, actually. Yeah.
And in addition to that, it will also make it possible to tell how many messages are there for a batch, because currently you have to like have the entire trace, like aggregate the entire trace, and then look at the children of the receive and like enumerate them and find if they have a messaging processing attribute, and then count them to tell that this batch had 5 messages. And so it's very complex and error-prone thing to do, and it will make it much, much more easier if the receive span will just have like an array of, okay, these are the links to the.
I mean, there could also be an attribute on the span if we think it's also like in the receive. You could, if you know the amount of messages that you have in the receive span, we could also propose an attribute that says how many messages are in this batch and during this receive.
Yeah, for now, it's very interesting for us, like to know if it's an empty receive, like if there are 0 messages on the receive, and currently there's no easy way to tell it, or consistent way. So I add on my instrumentations, I add number of messages, but then on other languages I don't have it, so I have to improvise. It make me very happy to see it in the spec, and I guess many other people that's trying to use these traces.
That makes sense. That would basically be a feature on this transport context layer. So when we talk about how many messages are there received in a batch, I think that falls on this level. And I think that's also a good first use case then to add to this batching point here that we will go to next. But this point here, Amir, that's a good one. I will leave this kind of as an open question here. So indicating that we basically need to answer this or find some kind of satisfying solution for those scenarios when working out the spec.
Well, I can also add the other issues to this document, and we can discuss it in 2 weeks.
That would be great. That would be great, yes.
Maybe also if you have the examples that you faced already, maybe you could also put them there, like the real world things that you faced. That would be great as well. Because I used a little bit the messaging system, but I'm not so well versed on it. So it will be good as well to see the examples that are like the problematic, not just the easy ones that we always have.
Yeah, sure. I can add like code snippets and Jaeger print screens of how real instrumentations are creating data.
That would be great. Thanks, Amir. And to just quickly try to cover then the last 2 points here. Basically, here we said that we have a span for create and we have a span for process. Or we may not have a span for process, as we saw, but if we have those spans for create and process, then we want to have those to be correlated in one way or the other. I mean, it's, as I said, I left it open here, whether this is a correlation by link or parent-child relationship or kind of a grandparent-child relationship. We had all those all those options in the existing examples. But to further kind of restrict that point, I just put this fourth point here that I said that those span relationships, for example, between create and process spans, those need to be consistent for each of the scenarios that we want to cover. So as I said, we saw in the previous examples that we have lots of different ways of correlating these spans together. And I think we should aim for just having one way of having this correlation that is consistent across all the scenarios that we want to support. So I think that is possible to find one way that covers all the scenarios, but I think then when we work that out in further details, we will see if that's actually the case. Because I think it's important that when you have like this, let's say this process state for a span, that you have an easy way to just, an easy and consistent way to just navigate from this process span to the create span of the message. And that you don't need to kind of take into consideration 2, 3, or 4 ways of how this connection might be made. And then to decide which way to go, you also would already need to be aware of the scenario, that the particular messaging scenario. So is it batching? Is it not batching? Is it process batching? And then depending on this scenario, kind of navigate in different ways. But I think for this very basic relationship, as we said, between create and process, there should be a consistent way of navigating between those 2 spans. That is kind of a very minimum I came up with, also based on our previous discussions and based on the existing examples and use cases that we saw. And I just tried to come up with that we can say, okay, we have a first basic agreement on this minimum, and then we can basically work on top of that. And like Ami already started, see what is missing, what in addition do we want to have, and also just to have a first sanity check and see if that makes sense for everybody here.
I think in some respects for me, I'm still trying to grapple with the mental model, because I kind of envisage things a little differently in terms of that the context for application and transport weren't necessarily separate. It was the same context passed between them. And then the separate context would be something like the message context for cloud events would be like another layer on top. So that's kind of where my head's at right now, which is, I think I'm struggling to like grok what the difference between the 2 contexts is. Is it the same context just in different stages, or is it 2 entirely separate contexts that are unrelated?
I think I definitely think the context term here is overloaded. But when I think in just open telemetry terminology of what the context is there, and there are contexts, it's just some information that you get that has like a trace ID and a span ID, and that basically refers to another span. Yeah. And I think when we distinguish those 2 contexts here, when you just imagine you have this process span, and the process span might have to deal with 2 different kinds of contexts. There might be one context that it gets from an, let's say, incoming HTTP request that triggers this message processing, or from like an AMQP kind of package that triggers the message processing, or it might come from, let's say, a receive operation that kind of receives a batch and then splits up the spans and then handles the spans to process operations. So this might be one kind of context. And the other kind of context is, as we mentioned here, this context of the message creation that is on the other end of the line. So basically you can imagine that when you have this process operation, you might have to deal with this message that has these 2 different contexts, and that you somehow need to handle. Does this somehow make sense to
Yeah, I think I'm still struggling because I've still got in my head that like there's the OTel context that has come from somewhere else that might have started as an application span, and then maybe HTTP or messaging span was added to it, and that's the context that comes across. And then maybe there's a message context in the context of cloud events. Sorry, I'm overusing context. That's kind of where my head's at. So I see that in that case there would be two, but for example, if it's not a cloud event, it's just a regular message, that there would only be one context that might have passed through application and transport pieces and spans, but it's just one context, not two separate contexts.
You mean that is then the context that passes through unordered, through basically the transport chain?
Yeah.
Yes, but then you already have again have two contexts, because you have if a context passes unordered through this transport chain, usually the context, when it goes basically through like a chain, it kind of changes from step to step. So for example, you have span A, span B, and span A, span B, span C, and then for you link A to B. For B, basically A is the parent context, and for C, B is the parent context. So when you go through the steps, this context changes. But for messaging, then we say, okay, we have this creation context, and we want to pass this context through those steps, but this context should be preserved and should not change. So we still might have this changing context that lets us kind of trace the different hops of the transport. But we also want to have this unchanging context from the creation span preserved throughout those hops.
See, in my head, I had that kind of functionality would be handled like with like cloud events message context. That if you wanted just like the application hops in a trace span, you will utilize something like cloud events message context to do that. But just plain tracing without any of that extra layer would give you the create, the publish, and all the stages in between, and not like grab something from further back in the chain and daisy chain it across and somehow link it down the road, if that makes sense. I was, I think, envisaging the messaging semantic conventions focusing more on the transport side of things to come up with how things look for AMQP, Kafka, RabbitMQ, all that kind of stuff. And then any kind of application level thing would be handled by like cloud events or something like that.
Yes, that is basically a different view than what I laid out here in the beginning. And I think it makes sense to think about that and see how we can converge there. Because basically what you say is that, yeah, that the messaging convention we are working here should just cover the transport context, and the application context should be covered by different conventions. And I think then we would deviate actually a lot from what we have in the current semantic conventions for messaging. Because as I said, the only thing that is common to all the examples that we have there is that it covers this application context. And in some scenarios, like some of this transport context kind of spills in. So
because the problem is really like, let's say, like if I produce a message and I send it to a queue or something, and let's say, for example, that I use a library that has auto instrumentation, so the library will be responsible for creating the transport span and so on, like the physical thing that was sent. I think that's what the terminology that they use there in the current spec. They say that the physical. So it will have the physical span send, but then when I receive this, it might be like a day later or so. And then how is how do I link, for example, that I received this and then it's related to the thing that I was sent yesterday? Or I think there was also an example like that a long trace that happens that keeps happening or waits for input from somebody. And then if we just look at the transport thing, then when I receive this, for example, my process that is listening for messages, and let's say that is also auto-instrumented with some library, and then I will have an active span because I received something. The library already creates the receiving span or something, the transport layer span, and then that's not how that's no way linked to the message that was being processed unless it unpacks the message and then do something that, like the instrumentation library unpacks the message and do something about it. But then you in the situation where I say, okay, I already have an active span. Should I take the span that is in the messaging and then make that as a parent, or should I use the one that I have active? And what we discussed, I think, last week was what happened. So like if I do this, if I disregard the active span that I have, which is the transport layer, and then let's say it fails, then I lose my transport layer span, like because there was an exception or something. Yeah. But I see what you're saying now about this, about the transport.
Everything I've done, I've always taken the context out of the incoming message and used that as the parent.
Yeah.
So to get that correlation and linkage to wherever it came from, irrespective of what kind of time gap or delay there might have been between a message going on a queue and it actually being processed.
Basically, in this way, you have used this, what we say here, application level context, basically the context that was persisted during the creation of the message, and this context that was persisted in the message at this time. Yeah, and I think that's also where some kind of confusion stems, that we often mix those two layers of context up, and then it kind of gets it kind of obfuscates things a lot. And I think it might help us to just try to separate those stages, and also maybe think that we have different contexts that we have to deal with here. And I mean, cloud events is a nice example, because cloud events actually nicely separates between those two contexts. So in the cloud event, you have this, when you look at the distributed tracing extension there, they have this application context that they put on the cloud event message that goes through unchanged through the whole flow. And then there is this other context that follows like the standard context propagation mechanisms, trace state and trace parent. And that context changes through like the hops the message takes. So cloud events actually has those two contexts nicely separated. I think they don't call it application context and transport context, but that's essentially what it is. And I think that is how
it's more a creation context if it's unchanged throughout the entire life.
You can call it creation context too, yes. Instead of application context, you could call it creation context, yeah. I just call it application context because it's basically the context from the view of an application layer, like the high level, and that context that actually then, as I said, helps you to, let's say, correlate two services together. The one produces a message, the other consumes it, and you can create, basically say, okay, those two services kind of have a connection, apart from like this intermediary or messaging broker that is in between. And if you go from the transport layer, you basically have...
The use case this is trying to solve is seeing how services are connected without seeing the transports between them.
It's not necessarily without seeing the transport, but it's maybe in addition to the transport. Because when I have lots of, let's say, as I said, microservices that depend on each other and communicate with each other, and they want to understand how do they connect together, maybe not always, but I think most of the times when I want to see those connections, I don't really care if there is a message broker in between. Maybe I just want to see, okay, service A and service B somehow communicate with each other. And I think that's also a scenario that we need to consider and that we need to cover.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think I need to do some thinking on it and see where I'm at with it.
Yes, please. So that's also why I wrote this down here. So please feel free to add or comment on that. because it would be great if we kind of could kind of align or agree on some kind of basis, and then continue working from there. So maybe, yeah.
I was just gonna say, I agree completely with the two different layers. You know, your example of seeing how 30 microservices interconnect, and I don't care how the messages got there, I just want to know where they went at the application layer. But I do sort of align with Ken's thinking in that, you know, with the transport layer being an important aspect for other reasons, as you mentioned, for, you know, debugging what happened, why did it take so long, or you know, why did this message not get from here to there as I expected? So again, just from my point of view, reiterating that I would really like to see the transport layer addressed, and I don't see why it depends too much on whether it's AMQP or Kafka. I think there's a lot of commonality in all the systems and the steps that happen along the way. And it's really just comes down to a protocol layer detail that can be abstracted through a propagator or something like this. But I would like to see the individual steps, you know, formalized in some way, because I think that'll help with, you know, a common approach across different transports.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. I mean, then I will strip it for, I will take this out here, that we say that the context propagation rules for the transport context are covered by different semantic conventions. So we basically say that I think we are 100% sure that those application, or regarding to, no, I think we can say we're sure that those application context propagation rules need to be covered by those messaging semantic conventions for linking, create, and process. And we say we need to create, we have to spans for both. I think for create, we can always have a span, otherwise we don't even know that there's a message. For process, we can have 0 or more process spans, so also depending on whether the message was processed, and as Ami said, whether we can possibly create a process span, so we might have 0 more. And we also can say that those create and process spans need to be correlated, and they need to be correlated in a consistent way across scenarios. And I think then what is open here is actually that we talk about how do we deal with this transport context, because yeah, all this here is about this application context. So then we need to think and discuss about, yeah, how do we want to cover this transport context. And for this, I would actually suggest that the next time we start discussing batching, because that is also for me personally yet an unclear area, how or what we want to cover there. And I think that will get us thinking about the transport context layer a lot. And that might us then help to figure out, yeah, what do we actually want to cover on this transport context layer. Does this make sense to you?
Yeah, sounds good.
Oh. Yep.
And awesome. And as I said, if this anything that we have here written down does not make sense to you, please comment here on the document and add your thoughts. And otherwise, I think next time then we will just write out start with batching. If there are no kind of questions pertaining to this that are open next time, let's switch to talking about batching.
Cool.
Awesome. Sorry, Joao, we didn't get to the cloud events today.
No problem.
Let's try to do it next time.
Yeah, it's just the update on the PR from the last meeting. So I addressed the 2 comments that you left. So that was pretty much it. So it can be done offline as well.
Okay, awesome. Then I think we should wrap up now because we have the Java meeting.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
Thanks for all the details. It's great.
Yep. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Thanks you all, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Uh-oh, did we have overlap?
There was a person in this meeting before, but I don't know where they came from.
Oh, well,
Should probably just leave and rejoin real quick just to be safe.
let's try it. I will post to the community issue again. Asking for more Zoom accounts.
Hey, good morning.
Good evening, Mateusz. All right, let's start with release discussions. So 190, I think we will hold for the Android fixes that are in progress. So I think it's fine if that goes into next week. It's more important to get the Android fixes in.
And thank you.
Just holding up our end.
Yeah, I was gonna have to put in like a big hard stop on the release unless I.
That assumes somebody helped me with the API caching module pull request. There are some open questions.
Yeah, I think Mateusz and I left a couple of comments. This one, I agree with Mateusz. This one can definitely be just weak, no bound.
Okay.
I
think it's worth trying out the virtual field in the NEDI listeners. It should be working now, probably. Can't either somebody do that or explain to me how actually to test that or to check that? I think we have some kind of unit test for that. This was a regression that caused the memory leak some couple of releases ago. So we have probably tested that. I'm not that sure though.
Can you get can this PR land without that? I was just gonna say if you can chunk off some pieces of it, then we could follow up. I can follow up.
Well, I assume that if we stop using so we cannot use weak values with weak log free cache. We have to have caffeine for that. We want to remove caffeine, so we cannot use weak values. And without weak values, I assume there will be a leak of some sort.
I know what you're saying. Right.
Can't you do weak values manually by just wrapping whatever it is into a weak reference?
Okay, that may work in that case. Yes. But then I still need some help with that agent cache and pull strategy, because it actually creates new key to get, and weak log free cache uses object comparison.
Do you think we could use concurrent linked hash map in this case? I think this one that you posted here, the shared resolution something, seems to actually be a cache and not just a weak map.
I can try.
And on this one, I mean, this is a good point that we used to have to do wrappers in some case where we were expecting lambdas to be passed in so that we could then instrument and call back. And that's shouldn't be required anymore. But if just wrapping the values in weak references work, also we can open an issue to come back to this.
Okay, I'll see what I can do.
Yeah, and ping with update end of your tomorrow, because I can tomorrow afternoon I should have time to poke around on it also.
Okay.
On this whole Android issue, I do recommend once you've got kind of everything merged, that Mateusz, you try to load it up into the Android project and make sure it works before we go through the release and then have to figure out another patch.
I would very much like to do that, but I'm on vacation starting tomorrow, so maybe next week.
Well, if you can, I mean, you can, once it's ready, just if someone just ping me, I can, I can grab the instrumentation API snapshot and try it out.
Cool.
Or the OKHTTP instrumentation snapshot, which will then have a transit dependency.
So hopefully that would be like early next week. We'll let you know.
Cool.
So there was a question of, should we make a patch release for this? It does meet our criteria for, as a memory leak, it meets our criteria for releasing a patch. It was a pretty straightforward bug fix. So if no objections, I think it probably will.
I'm not sure whether it makes sense because like 1.9 isn't really a new major release. It's like only 1 month of work. So I don't buy the argument that well, this would be a new major release or something. But if it's okay with you, you can always do it. But like to me, it just seems like needless extra work.
Yeah, so we got this feedback from kind of the reason why we drafted those patch release guidelines was based on some feedback from a user that they didn't typically take the latest, like say 190 was the latest, they would take the 183 or something. And that was sort of like, I guess some people do this. I hadn't seen that before, but it kind of makes sense. It's like, okay, that latest patch release should have all known, shouldn't have any new regressions, basically, is sort of like a safe release. So that was sort of the logic for making those patch releases for, and specifically targeting regressions. I don't know if other people have seen that, what other projects have done, certainly open for other approaches. But this has been our, primarily we just, anything that's a regression, we will patch it, patch release, and then memory leaks and deadlocks, even if they're not regressions, under the idea that those, you don't always notice those right away when deploying, and so they bite you in production more often.
Not directly related to this particular issue, but we're considering a patch release on the API SDK because there was a Prometheus breakage in 1.9. So that's under consideration. Yeah, I see it's already on the agenda, by the way.
Are you talking, Josh? We can't hear you.
Hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh man, my microphone is broken. It can't recognize the USB. All right. I was going to say, quick question on patch release. There's also an issue with OTLP metric marshaling that might be part of the patch release. But how are you treating the alpha modules? Like, I'm really happy to see a patch release for those. I just wanted to make sure that that counts as a real regression.
I would say it's still a regression if people were using it and we just literally broke it and made it unusable. I think that's still a regression that's worthy of a patch release.
Great. I mean, I'm really glad that we're patch releasing that. I just wanted to check and make sure.
We've gone both ways on that before with the alpha releases.
Yeah, well, I think in particular, since we're hoping to stabilize metrics like within the next release, if this is a broken release, that is not a good step towards stabilization.
Cool. Okay. Well, I'll check in if Anurag has thoughts, but I think we'll kind of stay with this with the idea that there are some, it's a sort of user-friendly approach for guaranteeing that there's no, or guaranteeing, trying to reduce the number of, or having a safe release kind of thing. Oh yeah, so I had noticed there were those discussions in SDK. This one was not clear to me. It was kind of reported in the context of the Java agent. I don't think we have any tests that verify this. I know in our repo, we do have some tests that verify this, but we don't use OTLP exporter, so it wouldn't catch this.
So I think we still don't know which version the person is using. Anurag asked a question last night about that, so I don't think we know. They may have been on the version before the fix. So
172.
yeah, I don't remember when the fix that we put in.
Okay. All right, we'll visit that with Anurag. And so these two sound like a go for patching.
Yeah, I think so. Someone will just need to have the time. to actually do a batch release.
Cool. Logging. Oh, yes, yes. The logging API revisited. So the question of whether we should have a logging API or not, part 7. The question I wanted to ask in particular was, so it seems like logs are looking like the preferred approach for in OpenTelemetry for tracking custom events. And so if we tell users, say like I tell our users, hey, to track custom events, you should emit logs. I'm not clear what I tell them, like if that requires the SDK, that feels weird, like to instrument their app to emit
So,
custom events.
Are they using a logging framework already?
Yes.
So that's what they should be using. They should be using whatever logging framework they prefer. And then we should hook up the appender, the appropriate OTLP appender, to whatever the specific loggers they want for custom events.
So the one thing that I find awkward about that is custom events, right? Typically you want to put properties, attributes on those. And the logging APIs are very awkward to do that. Like, do I have to tell them, okay, for every time you want to emit a custom event with these 5 properties, you got to stick them all into the MDC and then call your logger and then remove them from the MDC.
It depends what library you're talking about. Log4j actually has more direct support. There's like a map message where you can put them in a hash map. And I think there's this weird thing where you have an object that you can extract properties from, but I don't remember if that was when I was watching I'm stale on Log4j too, by the way. So that could be something that didn't actually make it. But if I recall correct, mapped message made it. The object to extract properties, I think, is there, but you need to use a Log4j specific logger, as opposed to using SLF4j or Java util logging. And so like the weirdness around custom events is like the best way to do it is kind of against convention of the standard logging libraries. And that is weird.
So I have a little bit of a question. Where is this custom events API in the specification?
It's definitely not yet. It's just sort of this discussion, like a lot of vendors have custom events in their backend. I know New Relic, I believe we do.
So I guess I would say, let's put in a custom events API when we have a specification for a custom events API. Because we don't have one, and we shouldn't be building an API just because in OpenTelemetry. We should do it because it's going to be a common thing across all the languages.
Well, if you believe that line in the middle, though, right? Structured logs and events are the same thing.
That doesn't tell us what an API is, though, for events.
No. But whether or not there needs to be, or whether or not there ever will exist a separate spec for events when there is one for logs,
There's no logging API spec. That's not a thing that exists.
Sorry, yeah, I just meant logging spec, not API spec.
Right, but we're specifically talking about an API here.
Got it. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense that we should be pushing on, if we think this is important, we should be pushing on the log group to drive clarity.
I think one of the reasons, one of the reasons I think they don't have a event spec here is like Go, for example, has structured logging and it's rather popular. And so like their default loggers kind of have structured logging. Although I guess there's 3 different ways to do it, whatever. Java doesn't. And so, you know, that SIG might be like, you know, set library, you know, languages probably already have structured logging. And we're here with, there is some structured logging in Java, but it never really took on. Is it worth building an API for structured logging because Java needs one or not? I think that's a good question.
I know the eBPF group, is that the right acronym? That networking thing. They're talking about designing an OpenTelemetry custom events API. And they're working with the client telemetry group, or we're planning on working together to design this custom events API. I think it sounds like this is also something that would hopefully fulfill the non-network, non-client telemetry use case as well. But if this is something that people feel is important, New Relic and other people who have event APIs, you should absolutely get involved with this discussion.
I think that's directed at me, and I am kind of involved. So,
but well, it sounded like Trask also had users who needed this. So,
Trask, for what it's worth, so I need to produce some custom events from like a little side project, and I use the log SDK directly because it doesn't exist. I mean, all this stuff is alpha, so you know, I don't mind using an SDK, knowing full well that might not be the pattern that I stick with it like going forward, but at least it gets me by for now.
Yeah, it makes sense, the stand of we're not going to define an API without some spec buy-in. What about?
I'll just say my stance has been very firmly, we should not reinvent a logging API. But a custom event API is a very different thing. Even if it ends up mapping into logs, it's actually, I think, an important signal that we don't have support for at the moment. So whatever we call it, custom events or whatever the name of it is, it's different than a logging API. And I think that I would be very supportive of having this be something that is defined in the spec, and then have the SDK implemented by emitting OTLP logs, for example.
I am very supportive of that as well, because my fear is if we combine logging and events, then you end up with a crappy API for both. But like the key with events is structure, and the key with logging is strings. So you know, like they're not necessarily the same.
They're very close.
Absolutely. Even if they structurally end up looking a little bit the same in OTLP land.
I know they're very close, but like from an API standpoint, right? Like if I want to throw an object in as my event and extract all the attributes out so that I can send it over the wire, that's a very different API than here's a bunch, like a map of string pairs or something, which is what we see from logging libraries. And one of them is a little bit more efficient than the other and a little bit more elegant, you know, like I think focusing on just structured events as the API surface is beautiful.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is that mileage varies for each of these logging frameworks, right? So some of them are a lot more structured than others and end up looking a lot more like that event API. But I agree with all this.
Yeah, I was I was looking for what you were talking about, Josh, of the structured.
I got it pulled up right here. There's a logger has the ability to log what's called like a message. The interface is message, and an implementation of that message interface is what Josh was referring to. It's called map message. And a map message is you basically create it from a map, and it's the structure that we're referring to.
There's also structured data message, thread dump message. The key to message though is it has a toString for if you need to log to console, and then it has the ability to pull out properties.
Even just this basic, yeah, mapped the message looks great. I mean, at least that would be an option.
I will say that with the log4j2 appender, there's a PR open for that right now. Anurag and I were having a conversation about whether we try to do a complete mapping of the log4j2 data model or just a minimalist mapping, pulling out the minimal set of fields that are sort of spec'd out right now, at least in experimental fashion. And so in going down that conversation, so Anurag thinks we should do a minimalist mapping. And so things like map diagnostic context didn't make the cut. And so if you did try to do this type of structured logging with log4j2, once this is released, I don't think you'll get your structure. I'm pretty sure you won't get your structure in there. So
yeah, I saw you had a good Java doc comment when you pulled that out of all the things that we're not mapping currently.
yeah, it's somewhere in there. That's a different PR. So this one, the one you're looking at, that's in the OpenTelemetry Java versus instrumentation.
And the whole figuring out where the appender API should live is a whole separate issue in question.
Right. And whether we should have an appender API.
And whether we should have it. I mean, I think we would be building an appender API purely for the agent, right? There's not really a reason for it, I don't think, aside from agent being able to do the whatever it needs to do to get that instrumented.
Yeah, so I just hope that log sig can make some decisions about whether it wants to have an event API and whether we want to have an API for RUM, because I don't know if we go project to the future and we have like a RUM API and an event API and an appender API that all kind of go to logs under the cover, the log SDK, that doesn't feel super good. So.
Well, I think for RUM, if we had an event API, the RUM API would be a convenience gem on top of that, plus tracing, plus metrics, right? But it would be oriented specifically towards the RUM use cases, which is a little different use than just a purely custom event API, I think. But
true. So it's composed of the other APIs.
The RUM case is pretty far away from, we haven't even really started thinking about what the API would look like. So far, it mostly looks like custom events plus spans.
One option, Jack, that we always have with that we've done in other places where it's not spec'd out is hide things under an experimental flag. So if you have use case for this, if you're wanting this sooner, we can always do that.
Well, I think the most useful one is map diagnostic context. And I'd have to run an experiment with that message interface for log4j2. But I'm assuming that the structure that you give it ends up getting like accessible via this log event get context data, which is map diagnostic context. So yeah, I think that would be high on my wish list, highest on my wish list.
Just to follow up on the RUM API thing, I think the RUM API will end up being the equivalent of the instrumentation API on the Java side, on the regular Java side. It'll be convenience APIs on top of existing APIs.
So hopefully on top of the custom event API.
Plus spans. Like it'll just like we have, just like our instrumentation API is metrics and spans, and maybe eventually custom events. Similarly, it will just be a convenience wrapper on top of that to make it easy to do the instrumentation you need for Android.
So in that vision, actually, it kind of presumes that there is at least an appender API or a custom event API. If not, then you're going to have to make a decision about which log API to use.
Well, what we can design that API without knowing exactly what the underlying implementation is going to look like. Like right now, we do this on the Splunk RUM instrumentation just by emitting spans, zero duration spans. But we can swap out that implementation with custom events when that is available.
Okay.
So short term, as far as bridging, as far as the agent being able to bridge the logging appenders, this is sort of what we were hoping for.
So this is the other question in here, which is like, do we have an appender API? And is anything in instrumentation blocked on that appender API? So the way that the PR works today with the new log4j appender is it has a compile only dependency on the log SDK. And so you have to bring your own. So you have to have your own runtime dependency on the log SDK for it to work. And that's fine. But if you want to use that log4j2 appender in the agent, I think some stuff might change. And that's a comment that that Anurag made on this with, where, and I don't understand how the agent class paths are like structured or thought about too much. So that's like an outstanding question I have there. But basically, he was saying that how to phrase this? We need an appender API. Essentially, we need an appender API in order to have log4j2 appender in the agent.
Yeah, so I can kind of show you in this diagram. So we put the OpenTelemetry SDK over here in this agent class loader, which is completely isolated. And then in the user class loader, where log4j lives, we inject the instrumentation, right? And in this case, the appender. And normally we have the OpenTelemetry API. So while the SDK is isolated over here, the API itself is shaded in the Bootstrap class loader. And so when we inject instrumentation into the user's class loader, it talks directly to the shaded API in the Bootstrap class loader, which then goes over into the SDK as the implementation of that. And so we would need a similar path over to the SDK for logs.
So you could then produce your own Bootstrap classes that do that mapping over to the SDK that are not something that's published by the SDK itself, right? That could be code that is owned by the agent at the moment until we have more clarity on what that appender API might or might not look like, right?
Right. We wouldn't be able to reuse the same instrumentation, inject the library instrumentation directly though, right? Because the library, the appender is talking to the logging SDK. So we need to have separate instrumentation that we inject for the agent. But yes, it's possible.
So I guess what I was saying was you could change that library instrumentation to depend on a thing that just lives in library instrumentation and then it gets loaded into the Bootstrap by the agent, right? Maybe. So rather than having the SDK publish an appender API, that appender API could be part of the code, some shared code that can be loaded in the Bootstrap by the agent or used by the user when they load up the appender.
So for somebody using it as library instrumentation, would they need to depend on this?
Yeah, so it would be some other component that they would depend on.
Right, right. So we need this separate component
Right. Yeah,
named
somewhere.
something.
So what I'm suggesting is, because the agent is the thing that needs this, we'll put it in the agent code, put it in the instrumentation code base. I guess that's what I mean. Because as Jack has proven, the end user doesn't really need this. They could use it. And it could maybe make the appender code a little bit simpler. But you can talk directly to the SDK if you need to, if you're an end user.
Right. So you're basically saying take this exactly this. I mean, we could take this artifact and just move it into the instrumentation repo.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm throwing out as a possibility. It seems like it could be a solution to this that wouldn't be a piece of the kind of the API that people would assume is going to be eventually moving forward into stability.
I think it's a good idea.
I kind of like it too. I think you'll have kind of funny class names, but I don't think that really matters because it's not something folks will use.
Yeah, it's not something that the end users should really need to interact with, I don't think.
And hopefully this will only be while it's alpha. I mean, hopefully we'll have a better solution by then, but at least this would allow us to move forward.
Well, actually, I'm not even sure we need to solve this problem right now because like you can't auto configure anything about the log SDK right now. And so what's the point of bringing any of these appenders that like the log4j2 appender into the agent until you can configure the SDK?
Do you mean it doesn't hook up like the logs OTLP exporter by default?
There's nothing in auto configure for configuring the log SDK, and there's no SPI hooks either for configuring the log SDK. So yeah.
But I'm assuming that will come. You're just saying in terms of
ordering. Yeah.
Ordering.
So we don't have to solve the problem of like, how do we bring these appenders into the agent until there's capabilities for configuring the log SDK such that the appenders would be usable in the agent. So that's all.
Makes sense. Cool. That was some good brainstorming. Thank you, John, everyone.
I had a thought from one of the comments. This is Peanut Gallery comment. Jack mentioned funny class names. I think the April Fool's Day thing should be the agent renames all of its classes to have jokes as the title of the class name. The end.
Bytecode, you read it. Oh God.
Yeah, I will say that I think there's a very delicate line that we have to walk around logs, specifically because there are so many logging APIs out there. Figuring out what's going to be, like, what's foremost in my mind always is making sure that we don't muddle and confuse our users. So the least that they have to worry about this stuff, the happier we're going to be having to support it. And if they like a logging API, then they have to switch all their stuff, all of their logging over to this new logging API. Everyone's going to be like, nope, not going anywhere near that.
I think the API the appender API living in instrumentation scores good points for what you just said, John. It's not confusing
because the users will never care about it, right? They'll never have to look at it. Yeah.
And one question then too, the Java util logging hackery that the agent does. How do we make that nicer not in the agent? Or is that not something we're worried about? Because I was trying to redirect Java util logging, and you know, it's like a system-wide .properties file or like weird reflectionary hacks that you do. And the SLF4J appender has this giant caveat that says, if you use Java util logging to SLF4J, expect huge degradation in performance. And that's just what we did. Do we have a solution to this? Do we care? I'm just curious. Like, do we assume everyone's going to be using the agent, so it doesn't matter?
I'm guessing what we mostly assume is that no one actually uses Java util logging for real life logging situations. I mean, we use it. We use it in our code base because we don't want to bring in more dependencies. But yeah.
All right. So if that's the answer, that's awesome. I was mostly worried about how we get our own logs. But yeah, gotcha.
Well, hopefully our own logs are not high volume, right? So performance shouldn't be a huge deal. Like one of our core principles is to not spam logs in our code.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about that SLF4J caveat unless, yeah, it's high volume logging that they're talking about.
Yeah, it is high logging. It's just there's a bunch of allocations to map between the models.
Yeah, it's a good question though. We do not have an answer at this point we don't have any library instrumentation for Java util logging. Also don't think we've had any requests for it, kind of to John's point about it not being that widely used. Cool. Just want to give an update. Nikita got us a Gradle Enterprise subscription, which is will let us do, well, the one use case that I'm excited for is we can look at flaky tests over time, because we do auto retry all of our tests just because of flakiness and not wanting to have the build constantly failing. But this will allow us to actually track and work on those.
My biggest hope is that we can solve our build cache in such a way that locally we can actually skip running tests which has already passed on the CI, which is currently not possible for some reason.
Oh, did the AWS? Oh, go ahead.
Is this going to require contributors who submit a PR that breaks to have to go create an account to look at the output?
Say again?
If a random contributor comes along and submits a PR and that PR shows breakage, are they going to have to create an account on the Gradle services login infrastructure to look at the build output?
No,
to look at what broke?
Build scans are public. You don't have any. You don't need any authorization to see them. So you currently can go to gspring.io or ge.junit.org and see their build scans.
Cool. Okay.
Nice.
Yeah, so our journey to replicate Spring infrastructure has already begun. We now have GE OpenTelemetry.io as GE Spring.io. So start.OpenTelemetry is the next stop.
Nice.
Yeah, only problem, it doesn't work so far. It turns out that our S3 build cache, for some reason, is not very friendly to Gradle Enterprise. So
will the build cache replace the S3 cache?
yes.
Okay.
So ideally and hopefully, yes.
Who's paying for our S3?
They do.
They AWS.
It's the CNCF
Okay.
AWS account.
Yeah.
Do they want to sponsor shared indexes?
Well, we have S3 bucket. You can shove whatever you want into there.
I mean, I looked at that. So this is totally derailing. I'm sorry, but I looked at the size of those. I put it in the channel, but yeah, the size of the shared indexes was pretty gigantic. It was like 3 gigs or something, but it would be really nice to have, and I think it might actually save time, like developer time.
In my experience is
downloading.
also that it's super horrible when IntelliJ starts to rebuild the indexes. It takes like an hour for the instrumentation repo.
Yeah, all the time. Like it's miserable. Yeah. So I don't know. I would love to explore that more.
If anyone has any tips on how to avoid that, I am all ears. Like avoid the indexes getting corrupted such that you have to like rebuild them. Because
Or like
if you
any,
just screw,
I think any dependency changes and it like goes and reindexes everything. It's super weird. But yeah, so I was hoping that these pre-baked like shared indexes, like if we had a way to like cook them once a week or something as a baseline, I think there's an opportunity to use that so that we don't have to.
If you find a way to pre-build those caches on GitHub Actions on CI, then
yeah,
we can totally do that.
And there is a command line tool. I mean, it's all command line to generate those things. Like there's JetBrains publishes a tool to generate those.
But then that's not a problem. We can create GitHub action to generate that. The GitHub action has authorization to publish to that S3 bucket, and so that's it. No problem.
But if this doesn't work, all you Eastern Europeans can drive down the road to the Czech Republic and knock on their door, get them to make it easy.
Well, to be honest, I think that's an issue on IntelliJ because I noticed that so I recently upgraded to the latest version and I was using a really old version. I believe was from 2019 because that's the one that I had licensed. And it is completely different how you open the project in one and the other. It takes like 5 minutes or even less to index the full project, all Java related stuff on OpenTelemetry. So instrumentation, Java SDK, Java, the other one, the contribs. In the old version, it takes like a couple of minutes. New version takes an hour. So it's something that they're doing on the newest versions.
That's interesting.
I'm not sure. Is anyone here like using like an old IntelliJ version? Because I can even show that. I'm not sure if I even have my old one installed if I removed it, but I'm pretty sure because I started to import the project in the old version and it was fine. And then when I changed to the new one, it was just like a pain.
Was that old version Ultimate or Community?
It was Ultimate, and I think it was like 2019.
Okay.
Let me see if I still have the old version here.
That's interesting to try.
So,
but yeah.
So I also work in like another large code base, which is Quarkus, and we seen similar issues with like older versions of IntelliJ being more nice to index stuff than the newest versions.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if any of you has also experienced something similar, but I believe that it's more tied to the IntelliJ version than the project itself, even though of course the project is big.
Yeah, so the thing that I've noticed is I can have the project completely fully indexed up to date, and then do like a refresh, like a resync remote fork. And if I think if anything in the dependency list changes, which it does like all the time, then it ends up reindexing a lot of stuff that I think it shouldn't conceptually need to reindex. That's kind of what it feels like to me.
Yeah, that's one thing that happens. One thing that can help is, I believe there is an option I usually disabled when I install, where you say do not automatically index new imports of stuff, right? For instance, when you change forks, sometimes you get like new modules added to the project, right? And so basically IntelliJ goes over there and starts reindexing everything, right? Now it is a pain because if you disable that, it means that you have to go to each model and do it manually. But usually you know what you're looking for, so it's way more faster if you just go to each model and say, I want to reindex that one, and then move on. But it does require some manual interaction, and it requires exactly what you know that you're going to require.
Every time I've tried that approach, within a couple of weeks, I'm so far out of sync with what the actual project looks like that it's
yeah, I mean, but I usually use it when I'm changing forks and I don't want to go for the entire pane. And then when I go to sleep, I just go and do a full reimport, and that's fine.
That's sound advice.
It's 2021. We shouldn't have to like walk away from our computers just to get the IDE to work.
Well, I have no, I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah.
The only thing that I know is every year things get more complex than simple.
Yeah. Another complaint is IntelliJ, its indexes are shared across projects. And so if one project corrupts the index, you have to like rebuild the indexes for all your projects. And there's like this outstanding ticket that I've come across multiple times. It's like years old, hundreds of comments, and they're just not interested in fixing it, or it's too complicated to fix. But if the indexes were per project, then like this scope would be less severe if the indexes got screwed up.
Yeah, I think the problem on that is, I think the issue why they don't do it, it will mean that for each project, it will basically means that you'll have a separate big Maven repository of indexes, because basically that's what they do.
Lower cache hit rate.
Hey, so we've got 2 minutes left here, and I wanted to bend Josh's ear just quickly about, we had a user who was not getting in the Java agent, not getting exemplars. And I was just wondering is that something that's expected to work or not work? And if it's expected to work.
They weren't getting them because I just fixed a bug where someone was getting them and it broke Prometheus. So that's awesome. Yeah. So here's the thing about exemplars are on by default, but to get an exemplar, you have to be using synchronous instruments. Okay. You have to have trace instrumentation. You have to be sampling traces, and you have to be recording your measurement inside of a trace, like inside of a span. So if there's a span in context and it's sampled or could be sampled, and it's a synchronous instrument, you'll get exemplars, but you'll only get them with the bug fix we have on histograms. So you have to be using a histogram instrument, actually, specifically. You will get exemplars on the other instruments in OTLP, but I don't know of any backend that consumes them yet. So that's a different discussion.
So in the Java agent, so we're capturing server request metrics, and those. Oh, maybe it's not. Maybe we don't have an active span yet.
Yeah, I just checked that, and we're calling the listener before we start the span, which depending on the metric should be fine because we capture duration at the end, and at the end we call listener, request listener add before we end the span. So it's still not in the context of an active span because the span is not current.
Okay.
And
So
I don't know if we
let's fix that. That would be beautiful if we could fix that. So there's two record. Well, there's a couple record calls on counters, but one of the record calls on the actual API, which I don't think instrumentation uses, takes context in as an explicit parameter. So you don't. You can actually pass in like the previous context you used, if that makes sense. If that's easier.
You would have to do that in the end.
After.
Yeah, because it should be called after the scope is closed. But it still gets that previous context.
Awesome. Yes. Problem solved. Well, problem identified. Good enough.
All right. That's awesome. Do you need, is this something I should help fix, or is that enough information?
That's enough information, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
That's exactly what we needed to understand, to figure out.
Yeah, so I just want to have a side comment of like, I really wish we just automatically got duration from span end. There's so much complication in making that just be a thing, but man, would that be amazing. Anyway.
Well, with the instrumenter API sort of solves that for you though.
Right, I know, but it feels weird that we're making you solve that. And then like, if users write their own span instrumentation, they don't get duration metrics if they want them, but it's fine.
Yeah, we really want people to use I think the instrumenter API is, because yeah, the whole thing of instrumenting spans and metrics, traces and metrics separately is also painful. So I'm hoping that we really promote the instrumenter API. Awesome. All right, 3 minutes over. Great to see everybody. Till next time.
Thanks all.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.